In November of 1918, in a small office in a small Pennsylvania town, a 61-year-old widower uncapped a fountain pen and signed his entire fortune away. The paper transferred every share he owned of the largest chocolate company in America, roughly $60 million in the money of that year, into an irrevocable trust for a school full of orphan boys. He told almost no one. 3 years earlier, in a hotel room in Philadelphia, his young wife had asked him for a glass of champagne and died before he could bring it back. The couple had no children. And so the Chocolate King, quietly, deliberately, ended his own dynasty before it began. What kind of grief chooses orphans for its heirs? If you like a Gilded Age story told from the inside of a marriage rather than the outside of a mansion, subscribe to Cursed Fortunes. I make long documentaries about the families the fortunes ate, and this one is about the fortune that was given away, in secret, because the family it should have gone to had ended in a hotel corridor in Philadelphia on a Thursday afternoon in March. Chapter 1. A boy raised by a father who kept leaving. The child who would one day own the largest chocolate factory in the world was born on a Pennsylvania farm to a father who could not stay in a room. He was born on the 13th of September, 1857, in a small farmhouse on the homestead in Derry Township in the Pennsylvania dairy country. The valley was Mennonite. The Hersheys were Mennonite. The Snaveleys, on his mother's side, were Mennonite. His grandfather's family had come out of a well-to-do Lancaster County Mennonite farming line in which the Plain Church and the Plain Farm had held together, generation after generation, for more than a century. On paper, the child was born into steady land and steady money. In practice, he was born into a house his father could not stay in. His father was called Henry. He was the eldest of 7, and by every account of him left in the family papers, he was a reader, a talker, an inquisitive and restless man who could not settle to a piece of ground. In the years after Milton's birth, Henry Hershey pursued in order the western Pennsylvania oil boom, the raising of trout in cold ponds, the running of a fruit orchard, the operation of a plant nursery, and at least 3 ventures whose exact contents the family never bothered to write down. Each one failed. Each failure moved the family. In Milton's first 10 years, the small boy was uprooted from house to house, from rented room to rented room, on the back of one of his father's disappointments after another. In the years of Milton's childhood, Henry left the household in all but the technical sense. He went to Philadelphia. He went to New York. He went to Chicago. He went, at one point, to Colorado. Postcards arrived. Money occasionally did. His mother was Fanny Snavely, and she was made of harder material. She was a plain woman, plainly dressed, a member of the Reformed Mennonite Church, and she wore the small white bonnet of that discipline to the end of her days. She was frugal, and she was disappointed, and she did not tell the neighbors that she was. She raised the boy on the household of an absent husband, on the wages that did not always come, and on the plain food and plain prayer of the plain church. She did not raise him to become a rich man. She raised him to be steady. In the private currency of the Reformed Mennonite house, that was already a great deal. The child moved schools with each of Henry's moves, and by the time the family settled again for a run of years, no single schoolroom had held him for long enough to teach him past the 4th grade. He read poorly. He wrote worse. He was small, quiet, unremarkable to his teachers, and, in the recollection of one of the aunts who tried later to reconstruct him, the sort of boy whose eyes noticed everything and whose mouth did not comment. What he had, in place of a schoolroom education, was a great deal of watching. He watched his mother work. He watched his father not work. He watched the failures land, one after another, on a woman who did not have the luxury of failing back. At about 14, in 1871, he was apprenticed to a Lancaster confectioner named Joseph Royer, in whose small shop he learned the trade of boiling sugar. Confectionery, in 1871, was not the industrial precision it would become. It was a craft of copper pots, a wooden paddle, a marble slab, a thermometer if you were lucky, a bare hand if you were not. You watched the sugar go from wet crystal to clear syrup, from clear syrup to a soft ball, from a soft ball to hard crack. And you took it off the fire at the moment your eye told you to. If your eye was wrong, the batch was lost. If your eye was right, the batch was gold. Milton had, from the first months, the eye. He had almost nothing else. He kept the apprenticeship for 4 years. When it ended, he tried, in 1876, with a small loan from a relative and no professional confidence in him from anyone else, opening his own candy shop in Philadelphia. He was 18. He set up, put out his sign, and began to boil sugar for himself for the first time in his life. 6 years later, in 1882, having borrowed and spent and borrowed again, he closed the shop and admitted he could not make it pay. The great wound of the childhood was not the poverty. It was the father. It was the tall, well-spoken man in whose absence the son had to grow up steady, and to whose faults the son could not, in any direct way, respond. Henry Hershey lived, on and off, into the son's middle age. He died in 1904, before the chocolate factory was fully open, and the two never entirely reconciled. What the son took from the father, he took as a photographic negative. Whatever Henry had done, Milton had learned not to do. Wherever Henry had drifted, Milton had learned to stay. Whatever Henry had left unfinished, Milton had learned to finish. And whatever fortune Milton would eventually build, when the day came, would not be left in the same casual hands his own life had been left in. The signature that ends this story, 47 years later, in a small office in Pennsylvania, is Henry's ghost, resolving itself. Chapter 2. 3 failed candy shops and 1 Denver secret. Between his 20th birthday and his 30th, Milton Hershey opened and closed 3 candy shops in 3 cities, and learned only one thing worth keeping. The Philadelphia shop failed in 1882. He was 25, in debt to relatives on both sides of his family, and out of a trade he did not know how else to practice. He went home for a season, and then he went west, in what looked at the time like a straightforward imitation of his father, and turned out to be almost the opposite. He crossed to Denver by rail. He took work in a Denver confectionery run by a candy man whose name is now lost. In the back kitchen of that shop, in a working day that would otherwise have been unremarkable, he watched the head candy maker do something he had not seen done in Lancaster, in Philadelphia, or in any of the trade manuals available to a small operator on the American East Coast. He watched the man pour fresh milk into a batch of caramel. Fresh milk, not condensed, not evaporated. Not the tinned imported product that Eastern confectioners had used since the 1850s, because fresh milk soured before you could turn it into a stable sweet. Denver, at the edge of the American dairy country, had fresh cream by the pail every morning. The head candy maker had learned, by trial, that a caramel made with fresh milk instead of tinned kept its chew for weeks, softened in the mouth rather than shattering, held its flavor into the second and the third bite, and made every East Coast caramel Milton had ever produced taste, by comparison, like a hard tack biscuit rolled in sugar. The Lancaster boy watched. He did not speak. He took mental notes. He stayed a year. In 1883 or 1884, with the Denver technique in his head and no money to open a shop for himself, he moved on. He tried Chicago, briefly. He tried New Orleans, briefly. He tried New York, at some length. In each city he opened, or joined, a small confectionery. In each city, in turn, he ran out of money before the trade caught. He was, by the count of the biographers, on his second, third, and fourth failure in his own name. In a country where a young man of 30 who had never made his first $100 was, in the polite phrase of the period, without prospects, Milton Hershey was without prospects. He came home to Lancaster in 1886 on a train ticket bought by a relative, with the clothes on his back, the notebook of Denver caramel formulas in his coat pocket, and no visible future. He was 29. He had spent 13 years of his life in the trade and had, to show for it, less money than his mother had. The thing that turned the whole account is a story that reads, in the retelling, as if it had been arranged by a novelist. He opened, in 1886, in a small rented room on the third floor of a Lancaster building, a fifth candy operation. He gave it a plain and hopeful name, the Lancaster Caramel Company. He borrowed a small amount of money against a small amount of collateral he did not really have, and he began to boil caramel in the Denver way with fresh milk brought in from the dairy pastures east of the town. He made the caramels. He wrapped them. He walked them up and down the confectionery streets of Lancaster. Almost nothing sold. In the first 2 seasons, he came close to closing a 5th time. Then a British candy importer, walking his sample trade, tasted a Denver-style caramel from a paper twist Milton was carrying, and placed on the spot the largest single order that any American candy operation of Milton's tiny size had ever received. The Lancaster County National Bank, in the person of a cashier who backed the paper against his own conservative instincts, believed Milton could deliver it and stood behind a personal loan. The loan bought the sugar. The sugar made the caramels. The caramels went to England. The English payment cleared. The bank was made whole. The next order arrived. It was larger. By 1894, Milton had roughly 1,300 people on the payroll of the Lancaster Caramel Company and was, at last, at the age of 37, rich for the first time in his life. The caramel that made him sold in penny paper twists at general stores across a growing arc of the American Middle East. It was one of the first American caramels a working man's child could afford to buy in a 5-cent purchase and eat over the walk home from school. The Denver secret had done what the Philadelphia shop had never done. It had made a small, quiet Mennonite boy from a broken household into a Pennsylvania industrialist. He wore a plain suit. He kept the same 3 or 4 employees he had begun with as his most trusted foreman. He did not marry. He did not drink. He did not, in the observation of the neighbors, look particularly like a rich man. He looked, still, like a candy maker. The lesson of the failed shops he kept until the day of his death. What the shops had taught him was that the fault on a small operation was almost never the customer, was almost never the product, and was almost never the market. The fault, almost always, was the capital. The capital had run out before the trade had caught. He would never, in the rest of his working life, be caught short again on capital. Every subsequent enterprise he built with cash in the till, with land bought outright, with sugar contracted for months in advance, and with a bank behind him only by choice. What his father Henry had spent a lifetime not doing, the son had learned, painfully, from a decade of failing. Chapter 3. The World's Fair that changed his life. In 1893, he walked into a hall in Chicago, watched a German machine make chocolate, and bought it on the spot. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 opened on the shore of Lake Michigan that year, and stood, by any measure, as the largest single spectacle the American Middle West had put on to that date. In one of the great manufacturing halls, in an exhibit organized by the German firm of J. M. Lehmann of Dresden, A full production line of chocolate machinery was set up and running, feeding cocoa beans in at one end and turning them, in the space of a hall, into molded chocolate bars at the other. Milton Hershey went to Chicago with, as far as anyone can now tell, no particular intention of doing anything but looking. He was 36, at the height of his caramel business, in a plain suit, in a hall in a fair, on his own. He stood in front of the Lehman exhibit. He watched a bean go in. He watched a bar come out. He watched the whole line run through its cycle 3 times. And then he found the German salesman on the exhibitor's platform and asked, in the plainest English he had, how much for the line? The salesman named a price. Hershey paid it. He arranged for the entire line to be crated at the end of the fair, shipped east on the freight rails to Lancaster, and installed in a spare corner of his caramel plant. He was not, on that day, buying an addition to the caramel business. He was buying a second business he did not yet know he was going to build. He founded the Hershey Chocolate Company in 1894 as a subsidiary of the Lancaster Caramel Company. In its first years, it produced coatings for caramels, novelty chocolates, and small molded pieces for the trade. In the years that followed, he began quietly experimenting with milk chocolate. Milk chocolate at that date was almost entirely a Swiss product, made by processes closely held and on equipment closely guarded. It sold, in America, for a price only the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue could afford. Milton wanted the working man's version. He wanted a milk chocolate bar that a coal miner's child in Scranton could buy for a nickel from a general store on the way home from school. To make such a bar, he needed 3 things. He needed a formula the Swiss did not have. He needed a factory large enough to produce it in the volumes that would let him sell it for 5 cents. And he needed a source of fresh milk large enough to feed such a factory day after day. Formulas were a matter of experiment. Factories were a matter of money. Milk was a matter of geography. He solved the third problem first. Only one part of the American East had fresh milk in the quantities he was going to need. It was the dairy country of Derry Township in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. It was where he had been born. In 1900, in a decision that startled the trade, he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company outright to a competitor. The price was $1 million. In the money of the year 1900, $1 million was an enormous sum. In modern purchasing power, the sale was worth in the low tens of millions of dollars. Milton was, at 43, a very rich man for the second time. He was asked, at the time and afterward, why he had sold the caramel operation that had made him. The line he gave, plainly, was 2 sentences long. Caramels are just a fad. Chocolate is the future. He kept the chocolate subsidiary out of the sale. He kept the rights to his formulas. He took the $1 million in cash. And he did what almost no wealthy American candyman of his period would have done. He did not buy a house in New York. He did not buy a house in Newport. He did not build a Fifth Avenue mansion. He went home to Derry Township, walked the fields of the homestead where he had been born, and looked at empty dairy pasture where he would soon build the largest chocolate factory in the world. He was not, on paper, a man about to change. He was a plain 43-year-old bachelor with $1 million in the bank, a subsidiary company waiting for a factory, and no wife, no children, no visible interest in society. Nothing had happened on the marriage side of his life in 20 years of adult work. Somewhere in the middle years of the 1890s, in the ordinary way of a candyman on the road with his samples, he walked into a small confectionery in Jamestown, New York, called D. Works. Behind the counter stood a young woman with auburn chestnut hair and a small, refined figure and a bubbly, gay, outgoing way about her. He looked at her for the first time. He returned. He returned again. He returned a third time and a fourth. He had, by the last of those visits, decided. Having spent his adult life proving he did not need one, having sold nothing of the caramel operation yet, and having built the chocolate one only in the small experimental sense, Milton Snavely Hershey, at 40, was engaged to be married. Chapter 4. The Shop Girl Behind the Counter in Jamestown. In a small confectionery in Jamestown, New York, a traveling caramel man met the auburn-haired Irish Catholic shop girl who called him nothing and everything at once. Catherine Elizabeth Sweeney was born in Jamestown on the 6th of July, 1871, to Michael William Sweeney and Catherine Elizabeth Maloney, two Irish immigrants of modest means. They had raised their family in a small Catholic parish in a Protestant town, and Catherine had grown up speaking a domestic language of Irish rhythms in a public language of American vowels. She was, by every physical description that survives, striking. She had auburn chestnut hair and a small refined figure and pale skin and a bubbly, gay, outgoing, warm personality that entered a room slightly before she did. She was called Kitty by everyone in the family who had ever loved her. She had gone to work behind the counter at A.D. Works Confectionery on 3rd Street sometime in the middle of the 1890s, in her early 20s, in the way that plenty of Irish Catholic girls of her generation went to work behind counters. She was not, by the money her family had, an heiress. She was a working girl in a shop. He was about 14 years older than she was. He was Mennonite by heritage, plainly dressed, quiet, awkward with women, 40 when they met, 41 at the wedding. She was 26 when she said yes. Neither family was entirely at peace about it. The Hershey side of the family was uneasy about the Catholic match. The plain Reformed Mennonite church of Milton's mother did not perform mixed marriages, and a Roman Catholic bride was not the daughter-in-law Fanny Snavely had ever imagined. The Sweeney side of the family was uneasy about the age gap and about the plain German man well over a decade older than their girl. Kitty's sister Agnes, the closest of the Sweeney sisters to her, warmed to Milton earliest, and she would, 17 years later, be the person to whom Milton spoke the private line that gives away the whole marriage. They were married on the 25th of May, 1898, in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. The wedding was held in the rectory rather than at the high altar. Catholic canon law of the period did not permit a mixed marriage to be celebrated in the sanctuary of the church. The couple went from the rectory to a train, and from the train back to Lancaster, where Milton had a caramel business to close out, a chocolate business to open, and a new bride to bring home. The marriage was, from the first, a love match. Every letter of the period that survives says so. Every recollection of a niece, of a foreman, of a housekeeper, of a Jamestown neighbour who had known Kitty as a shop girl says so. The old Mennonite man and the young Irish Catholic girl had, against every difference of age and creed and origin, found in each other something the other's respective world had not thought either of them was going to find. She brought colour into rooms he did not know how to fill. She sang at the piano in the evenings. She teased him about his suit. She teased him about the paperwork of the caramel sale. She corresponded, in a small clear hand, with the Sweeney sisters in Jamestown, and with a small circle of new friends in Lancaster. In one of her letters, she wrote of him, dryly, "You never saw anyone who disliked to write letters, as he did." He did not, in her presence, need to write letters. He talked to her. He talked to her more than he had talked to anyone in his adult life. What she had, and what nothing in his childhood had prepared him for, was the ordinary daily human joy of being loved by a lively person who wanted to be loved back. She taught him, in the phrasing the record has kept, the meaning of joy, of beauty, and of laughter. They tried for children. The record does not tell us for how long, or with what medical assistance, or with what disappointment. It tells us only that no child came. In 1890s, America, a childless marriage was a private wound made public by the small daily questions of aunts and neighbors and clergy. In the Mennonite reading, a household without children was a household missing its purpose. In the Catholic reading, a marriage without children was a marriage the church watched with a certain sadness. In the everyday reading of the couple themselves, the childlessness was a small, quiet grief they did not name in public and did not, so far as the record shows, blame each other for. At the funeral, 16 years and 10 months after the wedding, in the vestry of the Cathedral in Philadelphia, Milton stood beside Kitty's sister Agnes Smith and said to her, in a voice not intended to be quoted and not intended to be forgotten, "I never expected to marry." He said it after the fact. It is the line the whole marriage hinges on. He had not, at 40, expected any of what had happened at 41. He had not, in Denver or Chicago or New Orleans or New York, expected the girl behind the counter. He had not, in the plain rented parlor in Lancaster, expected the mixed wedding on Fifth Avenue. He had not, at 43, when he sold the caramel company for $1 million and stood in a dairy pasture in Derry Township, expected that a woman was going to want to help him choose the colors of every room in the house he was about to build. And he had not, on the day of the wedding, expected that he was going to have her for only 17 years. Chapter 5. The town he built for her to live in. When the factory rose out of the dairy pasture, so did a town, and the woman he had married chose the color of every room in the house on the hill. Ground was broken on the chocolate factory in Derry Township in March of 1903. The land had been bought 2 years earlier, a piece here and a piece there, along the small creek that ran through what had been open dairy pasture. It was, in the observation of a Lancaster newspaper of the period, the strangest choice a rich Pennsylvania industrialist had made in a decade. Every other confectioner in the state had built in a city, near rail, near labor, near existing infrastructure. Milton Hershey had bought a valley of cows. The reason was the milk. The larger reason was that he had been born in this valley, that his mother's family lay in the graveyard on the hill, that his own life had begun in the homestead, a quarter-mile from where the factory would now rise, and that he wanted, in a way he did not fully articulate, to bring the fortune home. The factory opened in the spring of 1905. At the moment of its opening, it was the largest chocolate manufacturing plant in the world. It ran on the milk of the Derry Township dairy farmers, who signed contracts to deliver their morning yields at the factory door. It ran on cocoa beans landed at Philadelphia and shipped inland by rail. It ran on sugar bought on the American market. And it ran, from the first days, on a 5-cent milk chocolate bar. The average American child had never before been able to walk into a store and buy for a single copper coin. The 5-cent Hershey bar, first launched at 1900, and the Hershey Kiss, launched in 1907 in its small pointed foil wrapper, were the two products that would define the company for the century to come. The almond bar followed, the syrup followed, the cocoa followed, but it was the plain milk chocolate bar and the small foil kiss that first stamped the Hershey name onto every childhood of every American who would live through the 20th century. Above the door of the factory, in plain letters, was a plain word: Hershey. Around the factory rose the town. Milton had not intended, when he broke ground, to build a town. He had intended, in the standard 19th century American manner, to build a factory and let a settlement grow up around it, however it chose. What he found, once the factory was operational, was that no settlement was going to grow up around it unless he built one. There was nothing here. There was no bakery, no bank, no school, no chemist, no doctor, no rail platform of any size, no housing anyone would live in. There was a valley of cows. If he wanted workers to stay, he was going to have to build the world they stayed in. He built it. He built houses first, in a great half-circle spreading south and east from the factory door, and he built them in a deliberate refusal of the standard American company town pattern, in a variety of shapes and sizes and colours and setbacks. He did not want a row of identical houses. He did not want the visible fact of the company's ownership in the streetscape. He wanted, in the phrase one of his early planners used, streets that looked like streets a family might have chosen for itself. The houses were sold, or rented, or lent, to the workers on generous terms. He built the schools. He built the churches, for every denomination that asked, on land granted free. He built a trolley line that ran the workers from their houses to the factory door and back. He built a bank. He built a chemist. He built a general store. He built a park, which he called Hershey Park, on the grounds of which stood a rose garden Kitty had designed. He built a community centre. He built a lending library. He built, in the years that followed, a hotel and an arena and a theatre and a school for the town's children beyond the primary grades. He was inventing, on his mother's grandparents' pasture, a small, quiet corporate utopia, the like of which had, in its ambition, only 2 or 3 American precedents. The house he built for the 2 of them stood on the highest ground in the valley, on a low ridge that rose behind the town toward the north. He called it High Point. It was completed in 1908, 10 years into the marriage. It was, by comparison with the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue and the Astor houses in Newport and every other American industrialist palace of the period, small. It was staffed by 3 people, a housekeeper and a houseman and a housemaid. It had a library and a modestly stocked dining room and a rose garden in the yard behind. It looked, from the road, like a large, well-kept country house of a Pennsylvania physician or a modestly prosperous railway executive. Kitty chose the colours of every room. She named them, for the household, by their colours. The upstairs guest rooms were the blue room and the green room. Milton's own bedroom was the gold room. Her own bedroom was hung with wallpaper of a soft rose pink and carpeted in a matching rose. The rose garden in the yard behind the house was hers. It was, in the ordinary way of a house designed by a young wife with all the money in Pennsylvania at her back, unmistakably a woman's house. The roses in that garden would outlive her. Chapter 6. The Fall in Broad Street Station. In 1902, 4 years into the marriage, Kitty Hershey lost her balance in a crowded Philadelphia train station and could not tell her husband why. It happened at Broad Street Station in Philadelphia, in the great glass-roofed shed of the Pennsylvania Railroad, in a crowd of afternoon travellers moving toward the platforms for the trains west. Kitty had come down from Lancaster on some ordinary errand, alone, on a weekday, in the way a young married woman with money in her purse and a full afternoon in a large city might have made a trip in the year 1902. She was walking, in her account of it afterward, at an ordinary pace across the great marble concourse, when her right leg simply did not do what she asked it to do. She lost the balance in her hip. She staggered. A stranger caught her elbow. She apologized. She stood for a moment at the edge of the crowd and made herself walk on. She did not, on the train home, tell Milton. She did not, when Milton met her at the Lancaster platform, tell him. She did not, that night or the next after that, tell anyone in the household. She was 30. She had been married 4 years. She had, until that afternoon in the station, been in every ordinary sense a healthy young woman. What had happened in the crowd was, from a great deal of experience in later years, the first small opening of a door she could not shut behind her. The record of the following months is patchy, because Kitty herself made it patchy. She was, in the observation of everyone who knew her, a woman who did not much like to complain and who did not, on principle, worry other people with her troubles. She wrote later, in a letter to one of her sisters, of a physical weakness that had come on her and would not go. She wrote of hay fever, of asthma, of a tiredness in her legs that no amount of rest lifted. She noted, in another letter of the same period, that walking up the hill to High Point tired her more than it should. She did not, so far as the surviving letters show, use the word illness. She used the words weakness and tiredness, and once a small, stubborn phrase, not myself. In 1890s and 1900s, domestic language, a young married woman's small, stubborn phrases meant, at first, that her husband did not really hear them. Milton was building a factory. He was building a town. He was closing the caramel sale. He was, in his own head, at the beginning of a decade of work that was going to take everything he had. He heard her when she told him. He believed her when she told him. He did not, in the first 2 or 3 years after Broad Street Station, take her weakness for anything more than the ordinary run of a young wife's small, ordinary complaints. The illness took its time. It came in waves. There would be a fortnight in which she felt herself again, in which she rode the trolley into the town centre, sat at the piano in the parlour after supper, planted the last of the roses, walked out to the front porch and watched the smokestack of the factory in the evening light. Then there would be a fortnight in which the leg dragged, or the hand refused, or the balance would go from one moment to the next, in a room she had crossed 100 times, and she would put out her hand and steady herself against the wall, and not, again, tell anyone in the house what had just happened. By 1904, when Milton's father Henry died, Kitty had begun to lean on furniture as she moved through the house. She had begun to arrange the household so that she did not have to stand for long. She had begun, quietly, to ask the housemaid to walk down to the town for the small errands she had previously walked down for herself. Milton, at his father's funeral in Lancaster, is remembered by relatives as walking beside his wife with a hand under her elbow that had not been under her elbow the previous year. He did not comment on it. She did not comment on it. At some point in the same period, Kitty consulted her first specialist. He said the phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life. The phrase was locomotor ataxia. He did not, in the language of the period, say what caused it. He said it was progressive. He said it would worsen. He said there was no known cure. Milton, sitting in the specialist's office with her, paid the bill and asked what the next step was. The specialist named a colleague. The couple went the following week. Over the years that followed, in a slow, expanding arc, they saw specialists on the American East Coast, in every city that had a name in neurology. Every one of them offered a version of the same phrase: locomotor ataxia, a degenerative condition of the nervous system, progressive, incurable in the current state of medicine. When she asked plainly what she had done to bring it on herself, the specialists shook their heads. When she asked what would happen in 3 years, in 5, in 10, they were, in the polite way of the American medical profession of the period, unwilling to say. That is what a marriage looks like when one partner has decided to spare the other the truth of what her body is doing to her. He did not know. He knew what she told him. She told him a very little, and told her sister a very little more, and told her own diary, if she kept one. And the record does not tell us whether she did, only the private worst that she had begun to see in front of her. The first fall in Broad Street Station had been a stagger caught by a stranger. Others followed. There were mornings when the leg refused. There were afternoons when the balance went. There was the plain accumulated evidence, gathering month by month, that the ordinary reliability of a young wife's body was leaving her, and Milton, in the plain house he had built for her, did not, for the first time in his life, know what to say. They booked passage for Europe. Chapter 7. The doctors of London, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. He took her to the best medical men in 4 capitals, and they told him, in careful and expensive language, that they did not know. In the years that followed the Hersheys, in a pattern that grew more concentrated as the illness grew heavier, spent an increasing part of their lives on the transatlantic passenger steamers of the great German, British, and American lines. They sailed east in the autumn and returned in the spring. They sailed east in the spring and returned in late summer. They sailed east on the shortest notice when Kitty had had a bad week and Milton had decided that another consultation with another specialist was the only remaining thing he could do to help her. The trips became a habit. The head stewards on the transatlantic run knew him by name. The best medical men of 4 European capitals examined Kitty in turn. The consultations took place, one after another, in London, in Berlin, in Paris, and in Vienna. Each of the specialists Milton took her to sat with her, examined her, took her history, watched her cross the room, and arrived, in the language of the period, at the same phrase: locomotor ataxia, a degenerative condition of the nervous system, progressive, incurable. Some of them said tabes dorsalis. Some of them wrote of a congenital nervous disorder. Some of them prescribed spa waters. Some of them prescribed rest. Some of them prescribed electrical stimulation. None of them offered a cure. The record, in the plain economy of the Hershey Community Archives, calls them the best medical men of London, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna. They agreed with one another. None of them could help. Locomotor ataxia in 1910 was a phrase with 2 meanings, and the 2 meanings had different consequences for a marriage. In the more precise European medical sense, locomotor ataxia was tabes dorsalis, and tabes dorsalis was a specific late-stage complication of untreated syphilis. It was, in the medical understanding of 1910, one of the eventual endpoints of a syphilitic infection contracted a decade or 2 decades before. A slow degeneration of the dorsal columns of the spinal cord that produced the exact pattern Kitty was living with. The unsteady gait, the sensory loss, the joint pain, the loss of coordination, the progressive slow collapse of the ordinary reliability of the body. Read plainly against the medical texts of the period. The Berlin and Paris diagnoses were pointing at syphilis. Whether Kitty had contracted it herself, or whether she had contracted it from Milton, or whether the European specialists were reading her case correctly at all, was a question the specialists themselves, in their own private letters, do not fully resolve. In the looser American sense, and in the practical usage of a number of the same European specialists, locomotor ataxia was a somewhat catch-all label. It covered tabes dorsalis. It also covered a wider set of progressive neuromuscular diseases of the period whose actual causes were not yet understood, and whose modern equivalents, the various hereditary ataxias, multiple sclerosis, the spinocerebellar degenerations, and a handful of the rare congenital neuromuscular conditions, were not going to be described for another 20 or 30 or 50 years. Under this reading, the label was a description, not a diagnosis. The doctors were telling the couple what her body was doing. They were not telling them why. The Hershey Community Archives, in the material they curate today, use the second, agnostic reading. Michael D'Antonio, in his 2006 biography of Milton Hershey, walks a middle line. He records the diagnosis as the doctors of the period gave it. He records the syphilis reading as one plausible interpretation, offered soberly, as one honest explanation of what the doctors were saying. He records the alternative reading, of a congenital nervous disorder that the medicine of the period could not identify, as another, offered with equal sobriety, as the one Kitty's own most sympathetic friends and family preferred. And he records the plain fact that the primary sources do not resolve the question. What the specialists were treating, on the record, was called locomotor ataxia. What was actually killing her, on the record, no one now can be sure. Kitty herself, in the surviving letters, does not name it. She writes of tiredness, of the leg, of the small daily accommodations. She writes, once, of Bertha, the trained companion Milton hired for her in about 1912, and of the enormous relief of no longer having to be alone in a hotel room. She writes, from Paris on a Sunday in the spring of 1912, one small line that has survived in the family papers. This will be my last Sunday alone, as Milton will be here on Thursday. Next. I am very happy. In her last 2 years, she turned to Christian Science. She stopped consulting new specialists. She kept the ones she had. She travelled less. She spent the winter of 1911 and every winter thereafter in Nice, on the French Riviera, with Bertha at her elbow and Milton crossing back and forth between Nice and Hershey as the demands of the factory allowed. She had, by the end of 1914, the look of a woman who had stopped hoping for the doctors and started, in a small private way, saying her goodbyes. By the end of 1914, she was nearly completely incapacitated. She could walk, with help, a short distance across a room. She could no longer, unassisted, cross a hotel lobby. She could still, when the light was right and the household was quiet, write a letter to her sister in a small, clear hand. Milton wrote later, in the plain, economical phrase he tended to reserve for the things he could not otherwise carry, that hiring Bertha had been the best thing he had ever done for Kitty. He meant, and did not say, that the best thing he had done for her was to admit, at last, that he could not save her by himself. Chapter 8. The Children Who Never Came, and the School They Invented Instead. A childless marriage in 1890s. America was a private wound in public. The Hersheys turned theirs into a document. The Hersheys had, by the time of the first Broad Street station fall in 1902, been married for 4 years without a child. They had, by the time of the first European consultations in 1910, been married for 12 years without a child. They would, in every year of every subsequent decade of their marriage, be childless. Whether the cause was Kitty's illness, whether it had been an earlier condition that had never presented itself as an illness at all, whether it had been on Milton's side, whether it had been simply the ordinary, quiet, biological unfairness that visits some couples and spares others, the record does not tell us. The Hersheys themselves never wrote about it. In the small private space where an ordinary Pennsylvania couple of their period would have discussed such things with an aunt or a sister or the family minister, they discussed it, so far as anyone knows, only with each other. What the record does show, quite plainly, is what they did about it. They invented, together, over a decade of quiet conversation, a plan. The plan had a small beginning. In 1909, on the 15th of November, in a lawyer's office in Lancaster, Milton and Kitty Hershey signed together a deed of trust. Kitty, at that date, was still able to hold a pen. She had come down from High Point that morning in Milton's carriage, with the housemaid to help her up the office stairs. She signed her name in her small, clear hand next to Milton's. The document was a legally airtight instrument, drafted with painstaking care by Milton's Lancaster attorneys, establishing a residential school and a home for orphan boys. The school was to be called the Hershey Industrial School. It would take healthy orphan boys aged 4 to 8, whose fathers had died and whose mothers, for want of the ordinary support a father in the American economy of the period would have provided, could not keep them. The school would provide, in the plain language of the deed, plain, wholesome food, and plain, neat, comfortable clothing, and suitable exercise, and an elementary and vocational education. It would house the boys, under the care of a resident house parent, in a small residential campus to be built on the grounds of the homestead, the small farm on which Milton had been born. The initial endowment was the homestead itself and a modest surrounding acreage. It was a real gift, but it was not, in the language of the fortunes of the period, a great one. The fortune of the Hershey Chocolate Company sat in Milton's name in shares of the company, and the shares of the company were not, at that date, transferred into the trust. What the couple had done, in the plainest reading of the November 1909 document, was to establish a modestly funded orphan boys' school on a Pennsylvania farm, using the birthplace of one of its co-founders as its ground. It was a decent Mennonite act. It was not yet the largest single-donor education trust in the history of the American Republic. The first 4 boys were admitted in September 1910. They came from Pennsylvania and from neighboring states, referred by the small charitable networks of the American East, through which orphaned children of working-class fathers moved from institution to institution in that period. They were placed in a converted farmhouse under the care of a house parent and enrolled in a small classroom set up in a converted parlor. Within the first year, the enrollment had grown to roughly 10. In the years that followed, it grew again. Kitty followed the school closely. In her last years, when she could no longer walk any distance without help, she followed it from the wheelchair. The small orphan boys of the first classes were her joy. She was writing, in every visit and every message about the school, of a wound. She was writing of the wound as a small thing that fed her. When people asked, later, why the school existed, Milton had one answer. He gave it whenever the question came up. He gave it to the New York Times in 1923, and to Fortune in 1934, and to a Lancaster reporter in the year of his own death. He gave it to his own housekeeper when a visitor asked. He gave it, on the record, to his own foreman. It was Kitty's idea. The line was, in the private language of the marriage, the shortest possible sentence for a very long private thing. It was not a public relations line, though it would come to function as one. It was a widower's small, clear statement, for the rest of his life, that the school for the boys he had never had been the invention of the woman who had wanted to be their mother. He kept it as a refrain. He kept it as a fact. He kept it, in the years after her death, as the one line he was willing to give a reporter whenever a reporter asked what had made a chocolate manufacturer in Pennsylvania decide to spend the second half of his life raising other people's children. By the winter of 1914, when Kitty could no longer walk the hallway of the farmhouse to greet the boys in the parlor, the school had settled into the small routine that would carry it, unaltered in its core, through the century. The boys got up early. They washed. They dressed. They ate their plain, wholesome breakfast at long wooden tables. They walked, in a small crocodile of children, to the classroom. They learned to read. They learned to write. They learned, in the afternoons, a trade, in the small workshops Milton had begun to build for them on the far side of the yard. They came home in the evening to a house parent who tucked them in and heard their prayers. It was, on the surface, an unremarkable American orphan boys' home of the early 20th century. Underneath the surface, in the paperwork of the Hershey Trust Company that had been drawn up around the November 1909 deed, a very quiet legal architecture was in place. The trust was irrevocable. The school could not be closed by any subsequent decision of the family, or of the corporation, or of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It was, on the day the ink had dried in November 1909, a permanent institution of the American Republic. Milton and Kitty had built it that way on purpose. Neither of them, when the document was drafted, had been imagining the $60 million transfer that was, 9 years later, going to be laid on top of it. What they had imagined was more modest. They had imagined, in the plain phrase of the plain church, that the school would outlast them. It would. Chapter 9. The ticket he cancelled in December. In December of 1911, on a European trip in search of a doctor who might help Kitty, Milton Hershey put down a $300 deposit on a stateroom aboard the Titanic. The Hersheys were in Europe that winter. They had settled into the villa in Nice for what Milton hoped would be a season of Mediterranean sun that would ease his wife's condition. Milton had, in that period, been doing what he had been doing for 2 years, arranging one more attempt at a European doctor who might see something the American doctors had missed. In December of 1911, in a booking office of the White Star Line, Milton wrote out a personal check for $300 as a deposit on a stateroom aboard the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic, sailing from Cherbourg on the 10th of April 1912. He signed the check. He put the receipt in his pocket. He went back to Nice. The check survives today in the collections of the Hershey Community Archives. Across its face, in the ordinary way of a cancelled draft, runs the word cancelled. He cancelled it in the spring. The reason he gave in his correspondence was straightforward. The factory in Derry Township needed him earlier than the Titanic's mid-April arrival in New York could get him home. He would come home instead on the German liner SS America, sailing from Cherbourg on the 6th of April and arriving in New York on the 7th. He telegraphed the change. He collected his refund. He rebooked. He and Kitty and Bertha embarked at Cherbourg on the 6th of April 1912 and went to sea. They were in New York, disembarked on the 7th of April. The Titanic sailed on her maiden voyage on the 10th of April. She stopped at Cherbourg on the same afternoon, took on the passengers whose staterooms Milton had cancelled his own out of, and sailed west across the Atlantic. 5 nights later, she struck an iceberg and went down. Milton was, in the days that followed, in his office in Derry Township, opening the day's post. The near miss became, in the private mythology of the town of Hershey, one of the small pieces of evidence that the town's founder was, in some quiet Pennsylvania Dutch way, lucky. He would tell the story himself, in his old age, when a visitor asked. He would show the check. He would explain, plainly, why he had cancelled. It was not, of course, luck. It was work. It was the pull of the factory in Pennsylvania that had brought him home 5 days early on a smaller boat. It was the fact of the empire he was building that had made him unable to spend an extra week in Europe holding his sick wife's hand and waiting for the mid-April sailing. It was, in the paradoxical way these things run, the same industrial commitment that had kept him from being able to save Kitty by simply staying with her that had also, on this one occasion, kept him from being on the ship that would kill him. And there is a small, quiet chill in the pattern when it is looked at from the position of the marriage. The husband walked away, twice in his life, from the destruction the world had arranged for him. He walked away from Henry's failure. He walked away from the Titanic. He would not, on the morning of the 25th of March, 1915, walk away from the door of a hotel room in Philadelphia. The wife who could not walk away from the illness eating her own body would take that door, for both of them. In the meantime, in the spring of 1912, on the passenger dock in New York, Milton put his wife into a carriage. Bertha climbed in after her. He climbed in after Bertha. He said something to the driver, and the carriage moved off, west across the city toward the Pennsylvania Railroad, and by the middle of the afternoon, he was back in his office in Derry Township, opening a stack of correspondence about the milk contracts and the trolley line and the new bank and the Titanic at that moment, was still sailing across the North Atlantic in fine weather, 3 days from an iceberg field she had been warned about and did not slow for. Kitty had, in the small clock of her own body, 3 years and 11 days left. Chapter 10. The Glass of Champagne. On the 25th of March, 1915, Kitty Hershey stopped travelling because she could not go any further and asked her husband for a glass of champagne. She was travelling, with Bertha at her side, on the American East Coast that March. She had crossed back from Europe by ship a few weeks earlier and taken a train south. Milton was in Lancaster. He was not with her on the journey. Everything on the trip had been arranged with the small, careful excess a rich man arranges for a wife he does not entirely trust the world to move without breaking. By the time the party reached Philadelphia, at some point during the 24th of March, Kitty could not travel further. She was showing the signs of a heavy chest illness, and Bertha had the porter take her off the train and into a taxi. The taxi carried her to the Bellevue-Stratford, the great Philadelphia hotel where Milton kept a small, permanent suite for exactly this kind of contingency. She was moved into a bedroom on one of the upper floors. A hotel physician was called. He examined her. He diagnosed pneumonia and reserved his prognosis. He gave her the standard treatment of the period, and Bertha, sitting at the head of the bed, telegraphed Milton in Lancaster. The telegram reached Milton in the late morning of the 25th. He read it in his office. He looked up at his secretary and said plainly that he was going to Philadelphia at once. He telephoned the trainmaster for a carriage on the next train south. He picked up his coat. He went to the platform. The train ran south to Philadelphia in the middle of that afternoon, and by 4 o'clock, or thereabouts, Milton was in a taxi from Broad Street Station across the block to the Bellevue-Stratford, and by shortly after 4, he was in the corridor of the upper floor of the hotel, and Bertha was opening the door of the bedroom. Kitty was in the bed. She was awake. Her hair had been brushed. Her hands were on the top of the sheet. She looked up when he came in, and she smiled at him, in the particular tired, warm smile of a woman who had known he would come. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed. He took her hand. She spoke to him in a low, even voice. She told him she had had a difficult crossing. She told him she was glad to see him. She told him, dryly, that Bertha had been magnificent as ever. She did not tell him she was dying. She asked him, after a small pause, for a glass of champagne. The request, at the distance of 111 years, still stops the reader. She was a Pennsylvania-American Catholic woman in her early 40s. She was in a Philadelphia hotel bed. She was, on the medical record, in the middle stages of a lobar pneumonia at the end of a decade-long neurological decline whose actual cause the best doctors of Europe had not been able to name. She had, in the private ledger of what she knew about her own body, hours left. She had, in the private ledger of what she was willing to tell her husband, none of it. What she asked for was a small, elegant, everyday luxury that carried no medical meaning, no confessional weight, no valedictory tone. She asked, in the plain vocabulary of a woman who had been a shopgirl in Jamestown 17 years earlier and the mistress of a mansion in Pennsylvania for the last 7, for a glass of champagne. He got up. He said, of course. He said he would go himself, downstairs, to the bar, and bring it back to her. He kissed her on the forehead. He left the room. He walked down the corridor. He took the elevator to the ground floor. He crossed the lobby to the bar. He ordered a bottle of champagne. He waited while the barman took a bottle down from behind the counter and opened it. He waited while the barman set a champagne glass on a small silver tray. He waited while the barman poured. He tipped the barman. He took the tray. He walked back across the lobby. He rode the elevator back up. He walked the length of the corridor. He turned the handle of the door. Bertha was standing at the foot of the bed. Kitty had died while he was in the corridor. Read the sentence once. Read it again. She had, in the small time it took a husband to go downstairs and stand at a bar and wait for a barman to open a bottle and pour a glass, chosen the moment. She had done it, in the interpretation the Milton Hershey School itself now uses when the story is told to its own students, on purpose. She had known, with a wife's clarity, that the pneumonia was going to take her that afternoon, and she had known, with a wife's clarity, that her husband would not survive being in the room with her when it did. And so she had, with the small last piece of agency her body still gave her, sent him out. She had asked for the one thing she could plausibly ask him for, that would require him to leave the room and go a physical distance downstairs and take 15 minutes to procure. She had spared him. It was, from a woman who had been sparing him her illness for 13 years, an act consistent with everything she had done in the marriage. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Bertha. He looked at his wife. He set the silver tray down on a small table by the door. He crossed the room. He knelt beside the bed. He took Kitty's hand, which was still warm. He held it. He did not speak. Some time after the hotel physician had come and gone, sometime after the paperwork of the death had been begun, sometime that evening or the following morning, Milton went to a small table in a corner of the suite, sat down, and wrote a short note to Kitty's sister Agnes in Jamestown. The note has not survived. The line he spoke to Agnes at the funeral 2 days later has. He said, standing beside her in the vestry of the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Philadelphia on the morning of the 27th of March, in a voice not meant to carry, "I never expected to marry." The funeral mass was held that morning. Milton had given every employee of the Hershey Chocolate Company the day off. He had paid for train tickets from Hershey to Philadelphia for any employee who wanted to attend. Several hundred of the town's workers filled the pews behind the family. The Mass was celebrated in the Catholic rite, for a Catholic wife, in a Catholic cathedral. Kitty was interred temporarily at Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, while Milton commissioned a mausoleum in Hershey Cemetery for the two of them. He would join her there in October of 1945. In the meantime, he had 30 years, 7 months, and 18 days to spend without her. Chapter 11. The 3 Silent Years. For 3 years and 8 months after his wife died, Milton Hershey travelled, kept the business running, appeared at the ceremonies, and told no one what he was quietly deciding to do. He did not, in the immediate aftermath of the funeral, break. He went back to Lancaster. He returned to the office. He signed the correspondence. He held the meetings. He walked, in the days that followed, up the hill to High Point, unlocked the front door, and went into the house. The rose-pink sitting room was as Kitty had left it before the last trip to Nice. The gold room, his own room, was as he had left it. He walked through each room in turn, in the small, orderly way of a man taking inventory. He did not, so far as the household knew, move or touch anything. He kept the house that way for the rest of his life. Nothing in Kitty's rooms was moved. Nothing in the rose-pink sitting room was rearranged. Nothing in her wardrobes was cleared. The roses in the garden were tended, on a small standing order to the head gardener, exactly as she had ordered them tended in the last spring she had been in the garden herself. When he was in Hershey, he slept in the gold room. When he was abroad, the housekeeper aired the rooms weekly and set fresh flowers on the small table in the entry hall. He travelled. He went to Cuba. He was building, in a small town 30 miles east of Havana, the second version of Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was building a sugar mill. He was building the electric railway that would run from the mill to Havana. He was building the houses of the Cuban town he would call Central Hershey, and the schools of the Cuban town he would call Central Hershey, and the hospital of the Cuban town he would call Central Hershey. It was, in the observable pattern of his behavior, the same project he had built in Pennsylvania, transported wholesale to a Caribbean island and set down again in the shade of the palms. It was, in a small private way, what he did instead of grieving in a room. He went to New York. He went to London. He went, in the autumn of 1916, back to Nice. He walked, alone, on the Promenade des Anglais, past the villa where Kitty had spent her last winters. He did not enter. He walked on. He came home. He was, in the observation of the transatlantic stewards who had known him and Kitty on the crossings before her death, quieter than he had been. He tipped generously as before. He requested the same suite as before. He ate at the same tables as before. He spoke when spoken to, and did not speak otherwise. He was, on the record of every business decision made in the Hershey Chocolate Company between March 1915 and November 1918, entirely present. Sales grew. New products launched. The Cuban operation moved from planning to construction to operation. The Pennsylvania factory added capacity. The chocolate empire, in the plain American sense of an empire, ran on his decisions and on the decisions of the men around him whose careers he had made. William Murray, the plant manager, had by 1916 become the day-to-day president of the company in every sense that mattered. Milton was the owner, Murray was the operator. Between them, the company ran smoothly. Inside the plane, owner walking through the factory floor once a week in his plain suit, a plan was taking shape. He did not, so far as the surviving papers show, discuss the plan with Murray. He did not discuss it with the plant foreman. He did not discuss it in any detail that has survived with his lawyers until the paperwork was to be drawn up. He did not discuss it with the extended family. He may have discussed it, in outline, with his own private secretary. He may have discussed it, in some form, with Bertha, who continued to work in the household in the years after Kitty's death, and who, in a small way, held the household voice of the marriage. He did not discuss it with the press. He did not, and this is the important negative, discuss it with anyone who would have had a reason to persuade him out of it. The plan was simple in outline and enormous in scale. He would take every share of the Hershey Chocolate Company he personally owned, which at 1918 valuations was the majority of the company and worth at that date approximately $60 million, and he would place them in an irrevocable trust, the sole beneficiary of which would be the Hershey Industrial School, the small orphan boys' school he and Kitty had founded together 9 years earlier in the November of 1909. The trust would be structured so that the school, through its trust company, would be the controlling shareholder of the chocolate company. The men who ran the chocolate company would continue to run it. But they would run it, from the day of the signature onward, for the boys. He would keep his salary. He would keep the town. He would keep the mansion and the rooms as Kitty had left them, and the rose garden as she had ordered it tended. He would keep, in the plain American sense of ownership, nothing else. Why he decided to do it in the autumn of 1918 rather than in the autumn of 1915 or of 1916 or of 1917 is a question the papers do not entirely answer. It is possible he had needed the 3 years to be certain he was not going to remarry. It is possible he had needed the 3 years to be certain the school was going to work at the scale he was going to fund. It is possible he had simply needed the 3 years to sit with what he had lost and to know, at the end of them, that the answer he was going to give was not going to change. It is also possible that the world of 1918, with the war in its last weeks and the influenza pandemic taking American lives at a rate the country had not seen since the Civil War, made the decision seem, to a man who had already given up on being remembered by an heir of his blood, the only decision the moment could carry. A great many Americans, in that autumn, were writing their wills. A great many Americans, in that autumn, were rearranging their affairs. Milton Hershey did, in the ordinary movement of a country in the shadow of two catastrophes, an extraordinary thing. On a day in the early part of November, in the small office he kept above the factory floor in Derry Township, he called in his lawyer, examined the documents that had been prepared, made a small last correction, uncapped the fountain pen at his elbow, and signed. The signature took about 4 seconds. He put the pen down. He handed the papers back to the lawyer. He told the lawyer, in the plain, quiet Pennsylvania Dutch phrasing he tended to use for the important things, that this was to be filed and not otherwise discussed. The lawyer, whose name is preserved in the Hershey Trust Company's own founding papers, put the documents in his leather satchel. He walked down the stairs and out of the building. He filed the trust that afternoon at the county courthouse in Harrisburg. By supper time on the day of the signature, in offices whose staff had no idea what had just happened, the fortune Milton Hershey had spent his life building had ceased in perpetuity to belong to him. He walked home to High Point that evening in his plain suit. He ate his supper alone at the table in the dining room. He went to the gold room. He read a little. He put the lamp out. He went to sleep. Chapter 12. The signature that ended the dynasty. In November of 1918, he signed a piece of paper that removed his own name from his own fortune. The mechanics were simple. Milton Hershey held the majority of the shares of the Hershey Chocolate Company. He held them in his own name. He transferred them, by the November 1918 deed, into a permanent trust, the sole beneficiary of which was the Hershey Industrial School. The Hershey Trust Company was formed to administer the trust. The chocolate company continued, under Murray and his men, to operate. The school, through its trustees, became the majority shareholder in the chocolate company. The land under the town of Hershey, most of which Milton personally owned, went into the same trust in the same year. The town itself, the factory itself, the chocolate that came off the line at 5 cents a bar, the caramel that was still being sold by the old Lancaster caramel formulas under a subsidiary, all of it now belonged, in the plain legal sense of ownership, to the boys' school. The valuation of the transfer was approximately $60 million in the money of 1918. In the same year, the entire Coca-Cola company was sold for $25 million. Milton Hershey had given away, in one signature, more than twice the value of the entire Coca-Cola company. In modern purchasing power, the transfer approaches $1 billion. In the market of orphanage endowments, no gift of this size had ever been made in the history of the American Republic. In the market of single-donor educational endowments, no gift of this size had been made in the history of any republic. It was, in one afternoon, the largest single-donor educational gift in modern history to that date. He told almost no one. He did not issue a press release. He did not summon the Lancaster newspapers. He did not tell the plant foreman. He did not, so far as the record shows, tell William Murray. He did not tell the town of Hershey. He continued, in every visible respect, to run the same office, to draw the same salary, to hold the same title, and to receive the same visitors at High Point as he had done before the signature. To an observer of the town in the second week of November 1918, nothing had changed. To an observer of the town 6 months later, nothing had changed. To an observer of the town in the middle of 1920, still, nothing had changed. In the small, legally airtight paperwork of the Hershey Trust Company, and in the head of the man who had signed the document, everything had changed. In every other visible register of the world, nothing at all had. He held the secret for 5 years. In the spring of 1923, a New York Times reporter named James C. Young came to Hershey to write a general profile of the chocolate company and its town. Young was an experienced business reporter of the older generation, careful, patient, and gently skeptical. He interviewed Murray. He interviewed the foreman. He interviewed the workers in the town. He interviewed the school's teachers. He interviewed, at the end of a week's reporting, the founder himself. He walked into Milton's office at the small hour of the appointment, sat across the desk, and asked, in the ordinary way of an experienced reporter running a factual question at the end of an interview, who owned the company. Milton, in the ordinary way of a man who had been waiting 5 years for an experienced reporter to ask him that particular question at the end of a long interview, told him. The answer was 2 sentences. It ran, in Young's own transcription, "I have no heirs, that is, no children. So I decided to make the orphan boys of the United States my heirs." The line ran in the Times a few weeks later, under Young's byline, in a general profile of the Hershey enterprise that was otherwise devoted to the mechanics of the factory. The story travelled. It ran in the interested magazines that covered such things as the largest single donor educational gift then documented in the modern history of the world. Fortune, 11 years later, in a 1934 profile of the company, asked Milton why he had kept it secret for 5 years. He gave, in the plain economy of his own phrasing, the reason. To have advertised the gift to the world, he told Fortune, would have seemed like telling the people to eat more chocolate to help the orphans, and his competitors would have said he was taking advantage of them. The line is one of the sharpest pieces of Pennsylvania Dutch honesty on the whole American record of Gilded Age philanthropy. He had not, he said, wanted to trade on the boys. He had not wanted the sales of the bar to feel like a moral obligation on the customer. He had not wanted the men who ran competing chocolate companies to accuse him of using a school to gain a marketing advantage. He had kept it silent, in short, because to have made it loud would have made it dirty. It was, in the reading Fortune printed, a small clean act by a small clean plain-speaking man. It was also, in the reading the record allows, something else. It was the shortest possible answer he could give to the question of what a man in his position was to do with a fortune the size of his in a marriage without a child. It was the shortest possible sentence he could give to close, from the position of a widower in a plain suit, the argument his father Henry had never quite let him win. His father had lived unfinished. Milton had, at some early point in his adult life, decided he would not. His father had spent a lifetime scattering the small resources of a small family into the wind. Milton had, from the day the caramel operation had first cleared its first English order, been assembling a great single indivisible fortune to prove the opposite could be done. And now, in the autumn of 1918, with the wife gone and the child never having come, he had drawn a line under the whole account. It was not a philanthropic act. It was the final refusal to lose a fortune the way his father had lost the small ones he had touched. The signature closed Henry's ledger. It also closed Milton's own. He would live, after November 1918, for 27 more years. He would go on running the office. He would go on drawing the salary. He would go on receiving the same visitors and eating supper alone at the same table in High Point and reading the same evening paper in the Gold Room. He would age, in the visible way old plain American men age. He would go on writing his name at the bottom of the correspondence. And every time he wrote his name at the bottom of the correspondence, he would know, in the private ledger of his own head, that the signature did not any longer own the letterhead above it. He had, in the autumn of 1918, given the American candy bar to the orphan boys of the United States. He had, in the same signature, and this is the one permitted plain reversal in the whole story, arranged not for his life's work to have an heir. He had arranged for it not to. There is a small, quiet difference between the two. It is the difference the video has been walking toward for 9 chapters. He did not build a school as a philanthropic offshoot of a chocolate fortune. He built a chocolate fortune, and, when the family the fortune was for did not come, gave the fortune to the school Kitty had wanted for the children they had never had. The direction of the sentence, if you read it as an ordinary act of Gilded Age philanthropy, runs from the fortune to the school. Read as an ordinary act of a widower's grief, it runs the other way. The school pulled the fortune to itself, out of the hands of a marriage that had, at last, no other place to leave it. Chapter 13. The Country Club Above the Ballroom. In 1930, he handed the mansion Kitty had chosen the colours of over to the country club and moved into a small apartment on the 2nd floor. By 1930, Milton Hershey was 73. The Hershey Chocolate Corporation, publicly listed since October 1927, had passed $41 million in annual sales in 1929. The Hershey Industrial School had grown from the original 4 boys of September 1910 to a residential campus that now occupied the slope of the ridge behind the town. Central Hershey in Cuba was operational, producing sugar and shipping the product through the port of Havana on the electric railway Milton had built. The Cuban town's own school and hospital were open. The Pennsylvania town's own trolley line was carrying the workers to and from the factory. Everything Milton had built had, on the 15-year anniversary of Kitty's death, come into its full working shape. He gave High Point away. The occasion was the creation of the Hershey Country Club, a members' club for the town's professional and managerial class, which needed a building of its own with a dining room, a bar, a ballroom, and rooms for events. High Point, with its wide gardens and its position on the ridge, was the obvious building. Milton signed it over. He kept for himself a small suite of rooms on the 2nd floor, above what had once been Kitty's rose-pink sitting room. He moved a small selection of his own furniture into the suite. He kept the photograph of Kitty. He kept, in a drawer, the wallet in which for 15 years he had carried her picture. The rooms downstairs, the rooms she had named by their colours, became the club's public rooms. The Great Depression had begun in the autumn of 1929. In the small, quiet towns of the American East, the effects were slower and heavier than in the big cities. Unemployment among the day workers of Hershey rose. Sales of chocolate fell, though modestly, from 41 million in 1929 to 38 million in 1930. In the towns around Hershey, the effect was heavier. Farms failed. Small businesses closed. Men who had come to Hershey for the wages the factory paid found, in that year, that there was not always work. Milton Hershey, at 73, in the small suite above the ballroom, made a decision that would, in the private history of the town, place him alongside the 4 or 5 American industrialists whose response to the Depression is remembered without cynicism. He decided that the town was going to build. He decided that whatever the chocolate company could spare from its cash flow, and whatever the trust could authorize from its holdings, would be spent hiring men in the town who needed work, on construction projects the town could use. At the peak of the program, roughly 600 workers were employed at full wages on Hershey building sites. They built the Hotel Hershey, a full luxury hotel that opened in 1933 on the ridge above the town. They built the Hershey Community Center, with its theater and its lending library and its dining hall for the town. They built the Hershey Sports Arena. They expanded the school. They built new cottages on the school's residential campus. They built, in the years of the Depression, more building than the town had built in any comparable period, before or since. Milton, in the small phrase he used with visitors, described the program as hiring the 40 men. Whenever a foreman came to him to ask whether they could take on another 40 men for another project, Milton would tell him yes, hire the 40 men. The phrase became a private password in the town. It meant that the answer, in this particular Depression year, was going to be yes. It meant that no one in the town, so long as Milton was alive to say the phrase, was going to be permanently out of work. He had, on the personal register, aged in the ordinary way of an American plain man in his 8th decade. His hair had gone grey and then white. His hearing had begun to go in the small, manageable way an old man's hearing goes. He walked in the corridors of the office and around the small apartment above the ballroom with the slightly rolling, careful step of a man who does not want to fall. He kept, into his 80s, the same plain suits. He kept the same watch. He kept the same secretary. He kept the same driver. And every fortnight or so, or whenever the weather in the garden was fine, he would ask the driver to bring the car around and take him the short distance from the country club to the Hershey Gardens on the eastern edge of the town. The Hershey Gardens had opened as a public garden for the town. Its rose garden was built around the transplanted roses of Kitty's original garden from High Point. Milton had, in the years after her death, ordered her roses moved from the yard behind High Point to the new public garden and replanted there. Milton would arrive at the garden in the late afternoon. He would walk, with his chauffeur or his nurse at a small distance behind him, along the paths between the beds. He would stop sometimes at a rose he recognized and stand looking at it. He would sit sometimes on one of the benches. He would go home in the early evening, in silence. In the town, he was known, in his final years, as a small, quiet, plain old man in a grey suit and a straw hat. He was seen, always, alone. He was heard, occasionally, to say, of the young women who worked at the reception desk of the country club, or of the small children he passed on his walk through the town, that he was very nice to little children and to real old ladies, but nothing in between. The line was his own. It was a widower's line. It closed, for him, in the small private grammar of his own life, the question of what he was to do with the parts of an ordinary man's affection that had no place at 79 and 80 and 85 to go. Chapter 14. The heirs he never had. He died on the 13th of October, 1945, 1 month after his 88th birthday, and his personal estate was worth less than 1,000th of the fortune he had given away. He had been ill, in the way of old men, for some months. He had the ordinary tiredness of a man who had done a great deal of walking in his life and did not any longer walk very much. In his last weeks, he was cared for at Hershey Hospital, the hospital he had himself endowed. He died in the middle of October. His personal estate, as probated in Dauphin County in the winter of 1945 and 1946, was approximately $900,000. The estate consisted of the personal contents of the apartment above the country club, a few small pieces of land he had continued to own personally, a modest bank account, his watch, his suits, his correspondence, and the wallet with the photograph in it. The chocolate fortune he had built was not in the estate. It had not been in his name for 27 years. It belonged, on the 15th of November, 1945, exactly where he had put it, which was in the trust for the school. He was interred, according to the arrangements made in 1915, in the family mausoleum at Hershey Cemetery, beside Kitty, whose remains had been moved from Laurel Hill some years earlier. The mausoleum was a modest stone building on the edge of a wooded slope. Its inscription bore both their names. His funeral was attended by every serving officer of the Hershey Chocolate Company, by every teacher of the Hershey Industrial School, by every senior boy of the school, by the townspeople, and by the delegations sent from Havana and from Central Hershey, Cuba. The chocolate factory closed for the day. The school did not close. The trust did not close. The chocolate company did not close. The town did not close. The Milton Hershey School today still stands on the slopes of the same ridge above the town. It educates roughly 2,000 children in a full residential boarding school, kindergarten through 12th grade, at no cost to the child or the child's family. Its eligibility has been expanded over the decades from the original narrow class of orphan boys aged 4 to 8, whose fathers had died, to a broader class of children from low-income households. The Hershey Trust Company, custodian of the trust Milton signed away in November 1918, holds one of the largest single-donor educational endowments in the world. Its holdings are measured, in the current year, in many billions of dollars. The Hershey Company, listed on the New York Stock Exchange as a publicly traded corporation, has as its controlling shareholder, still, the Milton Hershey School Trust. Every Hershey bar sold in an American supermarket in the current year is sold in the plain arithmetic of who owns the company for the boys and girls of Milton Hershey School. The signature has held. There is a strangeness in the arithmetic that is worth naming plainly at the end. Milton Hershey did not become the richest man in America. He was not, at any point in his life, close to the top of the American wealth lists. He was rich in the plain, honest sense of the word, but he was outsold in the ordinary Gilded Age league tables by the Rockefellers, by the Fricks, by the Carnegies, by the Morgans, by the Vanderbilts, by the Astors, by every dynasty whose fortune had been made in oil or steel or banking or railways or land. He built one chocolate company. He built one company town. He had one wife. He had no children. He signed one document. And the document has, in the 81 years since his death, done more work in the daily lives of more American children than any other single act of private philanthropy of the American 20th century. The plain sum of the accounts, at the distance we now read them from, is that the fortune did not go to a bloodline, was in the end the fortune that has lasted longest. Every Gilded Age fortune of any size has been asked, in the course of its own family history, what it wished to become. Almost every one of them was answered by an heir. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Stuarts, the Hearsts, the Dukes, each of them saw its fortune diluted through unserious grandchildren or broken at the hands of one dramatic heir. In the small Pennsylvania answer of Milton Hershey, in the plain suit, in the plain office, in the plain November of 1918, the question was answered without an heir. The Hershey Company has not been sold. The trust has not been dissolved. The school has not been closed. The signature has held. And it has held because Kitty, on the 25th of March, 1915, in a hotel bed on an upper floor of the Bellevue-Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, asked her husband for a glass of champagne and sent him downstairs to fetch it, so that he would not have to be in the room when she died. He was in the corridor. He had the tray in his hand. He had the champagne in the glass. He walked the length of the corridor. He turned the handle of the door. The video ends where it began. He is standing in a doorway of a hotel room. His wife is not, any longer, on the other side of the door. The signature that will end the dynasty is 3 years and 8 months in the future, in a small office in a small Pennsylvania town, in the plain hand of the man who is at this moment holding a small silver tray that no one will ever drink from. The chocolate factory, 500 miles to the west, is running. The school on the ridge above the factory is running. The boys who will be Milton Hershey's heirs are asleep in the dormitories on the hill. The fortune he built has been a monument. The town he built has been a monument. The company that bears his name has been a monument. The school that bears his name has been a monument. and the largest single-donor education trust in the history of the American Republic, began, at the last, as a widower's answer to the question of what a man does with a fortune that has, in a hotel bed in Philadelphia on a Thursday afternoon in March, run out of a family to give it to. It was Kitty's idea. If you want to hear more Gilded Age stories told from the inside of a marriage rather than the outside of a mansion, subscribe to Cursed Fortunes. And I would like to hear from you in the comments below. If you had built a fortune with the person you loved and lost her before you could spend it, would you have given it to strangers or held it against the world? Tell me what you would have done. I will read them.